This is during a what is this? This is during a left single stance, and the robot is perturbed to the left. So what the policy does, what the optimizer does, is I figures out, okay, I need to put my right foot as close as possible to the boundary, and then take a very big left step in the next one. So that's exactly what the optimizer does, and that's shown by these magenta lines in the bottom plot. So here it's taking a short right step, and then it takes a short left big step. And if I run this thing on robot, it sort of looks like this. There's a lot of robot abuse in these videos, but the idea is you can give it a fairly big perturbation and it's able to catch itself. So in the sagittal plan, I couldn't kick it hard to have a multi-step strategy, but in the lateral direction, it's much easier to do something like this. Although the optimizer doesn't explicitly compute for a multi-step strategy, it comes out very naturally because I'm running this part in a receding horizon way. This is another example of push recovery during some kind of a nominal forward walking. And this is the data traces for one of the lateral push recovery examples. Again, the first one is the center of mass trajectory versus where the feet went. And the second plot is the center of mass velocity trace versus the nominal or planned by the DDP planner. And the last one is the foot placement and also the swing foot positions and the center of pressure. So if we actually look at this, for the second plot, the center of mass velocity is very, very wiggly. So in some sense, we're not really controlling the center of mass state very well. There's a lot of oscillation in the velocity traces, and that oscillation reflects very naturally in the optimized foot placement, which is shown by these orange lines. That's because the foot placement controller, the only control authority for it is where to put down its foot. So it doesn't actually have a continuous commands to damp out these oscillations. But on the other hand, it actually indicates that for faster walking, you don't have to have really good or very precise control of the center of mass state. Instead, what's important is as long as you can put down your foot fast in roughly where it needs to be to catch itself, you're okay. So that's a very interesting insight for me. You can run this controller as is in another scenario, which is in this case walking over unstructured terrain. So these cinder blocks, they're not fixed to the environment. They can roll and rock under the foot. And the controller is in this case, the support polygon under each foot is very narrow, so it doesn't really have much control in the single stance phase. And it's relying a lot on foot placement to regain balance. You can also do some more benign human-robot interactions. In this case, I'm guiding the robot to a desired position by dragging its arm, essentially. So it thinks the robot thinks it's falling down and towards the direction of the drag, and it's taking steps in those directions to recover. So that's how during all these experiments, after I push them, I can just sort of walk them back into a place right under the blaze. I don't have to redo the experiments or restart the robot, which is kind of nice. So up to this point, I've talked about how to generate Cartesian commands, Cartesian motions for the center of mass, and I skipped on the spin foot, but essentially they are computed or they're represented as splines. So I have these Cartesian accelerations, Cartesian motions I want to track. And if we look at the robot API, the joint level controllers, they take commands as desired joint positions, for example, joint velocities and joint torques. And I need a way to go from these Cartesian motions to something I can directly apply on the robot. And this part is taken care about by the full body controller. So the basic idea is it's doing a full body inverse dynamics. It's the objective is to try to track these desired accelerations, desired motions, and the output is what's the what's the combination of possible accelerations, the contact force and torques, and also the joint level torques. So this is also formulated as a quadratic program, which is solvable at a very fast speed. In my case, I run this controller at 500 hertz. Again, because we're only looking at the current time step, this QP optimization is greedy in the sense it follows the gradient only for one time step. And our hope is to try to put this value function inside the cost function so that a QP will at least try to reason about what's going to happen in the future, at least on the center of mass level. So we're trying to use this value function here to make the QP not a greedy optimization anymore. Right now we're only using the center of mass model's value function, but for future work I would like to extend it to a more full body dynamics that's planned offline, for example. So just to quick recap, this is the canonical form for a quadratic program. And in this case, the cost function that I'm minimizing looks something like this. So it's A times A is a matrix here times a vector I'm trying to optimize minus a vector, a linear vector. And if we look at the A and B, we can decompose it row-wise into different blocks. And each row of this represents a distinct objective I want to minimize. So the things I'm optimizing is the vector of the accelerations, the joint torques, and also the contact force and torque. So in the document, the torque is actually linearly dependent on the acceleration and the contact wrench. So you don't have to include the torque in the actual optimization. I left it in this slide because it's a little bit conceptually easier to see directly, but that's just a quick note. In terms of objectives, they're all specified in roughly this form. So these three guys, the position, velocity, and acceleration, these are the planned values. They come from the planners, they come from the splines for the swing foot. And this is, on the left side, this is the input to the quadratic program, to the inverse dynamics solver. So I'm having a PD form, basically, plus a feed-forward acceleration. And we can use this equation to relate the Cartesian acceleration here with respect to the joint accelerations, that is Q double dot. So, here is sort of a quick example or list of the possible tasks or the possible objectives we want to minimize in this QP. So for example, I talked about center of mass, I talked about the swing foot, but we can also try to include an objective that's tracking angular momentum profile. In my case, it's not actually planned yet, but in the future, I want to do that. Aside from these, we can also do pose tracking or posture tracking for example, for the pelvis orientation, for the torso orientation. We can do this for the hand, for manipulations. And if we want to control individual joints, we can include that as well. So all these objectives, we can put them in this form, this A times A vector minus B form. So here's a quick example of what the A matrix and the B vector looks like for the center of mass objective. Okay. The inequality constraints are mostly related to the contact force and torque constraints. For example, I can't violate the friction cone. The center of pressure has to be in the foot, such as that. We can also include inequality constraints that's representing joint torque limits. Also, in the future, I want to add inequality constraints for motion constraints, such as joint angle limits or the reachability for swing foot, for example. And the equality constraints in the QP is basically the rigid body dynamics, in this case the equations of motions. Now we have the motion planner for the center of mass, the swing foot, and we can do foot placement. We have a awesome inverse dynamics module. So we have roughly the full hierarchy now. But if we actually want to run this on a robot, it doesn't work very well. That's because our dynamics model is not very accurate. There's unmodeled friction. The inertia parameters can be off. There are many things that's not considered properly by the model. So if you just do inverse dynamics and torque control on the robot, it can be okay for stance foot or standing balance, but for lightly weighted joints such as swing foot or the swing-like joints, and also for the arms, the motion tracking part is terrible. And an intuitive explanation for that is because, for example, to move these lightly weighted joints, loaded joints, the inertial forces computed by inverse dynamics is, let's say, on the order of 10 Newton meters. But if you also have a 10 Newton meter friction force, you're not going to get very good motion tracking. So a practical solution to this is introduce some kinematic tracking. In our case, we had actually developed two completely separate modules for the walking control and the manipulation part. So on the left, the walking controller has a low-level full-body controller that's inverse dynamics dominant. And then I integrate the desired accelerations into the desired velocity, and then I apply those on the robot directly. But for the manipulation, I actually went back to doing an inverse kinematics, full-blown inverse kinematics first. And then I do inverse dynamics to stabilize around the IK solution. The main reason for making this distinction is because if I include all the inverse kinematics computation, all the inverse kinematics constraints in the inverse dynamics, it doesn't solve as fast. And for manipulation, I run into these kinematic constraints all the time. But I rarely run into any dynamic constraints, which is sort of flipped for the walking case. For walking, I run into the dynamic constraints all the time, but it very rarely runs into the kinematic constraints. So that's the main motivation for making this distinction. In the future work, I want to merge these two things together because inverse kinematics is, it can be solved as part of inverse dynamics directly. So here's an example about I can still achieve sort of not so compliant, sort of pseudo-compliant behaviors in a very low time scale. So here I'm pushing the robot's hand, and it's trying to maintain a zero force and torque using a force torque sensor at the wrist. So this is achieved by essentially just changing the target positions, target pose of the hand in the IK targets. This part is useful for the DRC in the drill cutting task. So in that task, the robot needs to apply a small amount of vertical force on the drywall to maintain a reliable cut. I believe Jerry's group also have something similar to this for their manipulation thing as well. Okay, now I want to briefly talk about the bottom layer, which is the very bottom one, which is running on the robot itself. This is the joint level controllers. We spend a lot of energy trying to tune gains and some filter parameters to get as good as a joint level tracking as we can on the robot. And here I essentially cover the first two parts. So I need kinematic targets, and they come out by either doing inverse kinematics or by integrating the desired accelerations. For the joint level controllers, we figured out that if we specify gains directly in the joint space for the linear actuators, it doesn't actually give us as high performance as if we want to, as if we specify the gains in the actuator space. So we had to do essentially gain scheduling based on where the actuator is. Also, there's an artifact from Boston Dynamics velocity filter. So we did onboard filtering ourselves. Jerry's group had some other more complicated compensation schemes for backlash on their end. And also it's a fairly typical thing for hydraulic actuators to do velocity compensations to get better force tracking. So here is a plot showing the velocity estimate artifact here. So the blue trace is if you just take the finite difference between the position signal, and the red trace is what the Boston Dynamics default velocity filter gives you. So an interesting thing is it's very sensitive to a sharp change here, for example, but it's actually a lot slower for the low frequency part. And because of this spike, we can't really turn velocity gain high enough to get good tracking performance. But if you actually look at, for example, just a second order low pass filter here, which is this, what is this? Green? Yes, this is green. The green line, it actually behaves much more benignly in this case. So at the end, we used just a very simple low pass filter to replace the Boston Dynamics one, and suddenly we can increase the velocity. We can increase the velocity gains by a significant amount. So here's a video of the robot walking on essentially unmodeled shoes. So these shoes are custom-made force torque sensors, and the point here is if we just do inverse dynamics without modeling the mass and inertia for the foot, it's hopeless to have any good motion tracking. But with all these kinematic things, even though I'm not modeling them at all in the inverse dynamics level, it still comes out fine. This also indicates that we're giving up a fair amount in terms of compliance during a swing. So if we look at the data at touchdown events, the FZ, so the vertical force, about the sensed vertical force versus the computed one by the inverse dynamics, they mismatch by a lot. So we're eating a lot of impact in this case. It's not a big deal for a very heavy robot like Alice, but it's going to be much more bigger problem for lighter robots. And that's something we need to think about. So this is sort of a compromise between compliance and motion tracking, essentially. Okay, that covers all the current implementations of this work on the robot. And here are a bunch of things that I consider important. Some of them I have a good idea as how to do them, so they're rather low-hanging fruits. But some of them are some more longer-term research questions that's more open-ended. The first thing I want to talk about is introducing angular momentums. So this is a quick example of using angular momentum in a receding horizon controller, but it's only for standing balance. So I want to incorporate this part into the walking and also into the center of mass or the point mass planning level. Because I think angular momentum is very important for changing or getting that extra bit of center of mass acceleration if you can't change your foot placement, if you can't change where your foot goes. So I think that's a fairly low-hanging fruit to achieve in the near future. The second thing I want to talk about is step timing when doing the stepping strategy or when doing walking. So here I'm showing essentially the basin of attraction for different strategies. The first column is if you can just take footsteps, you can't vary when to put down a footstep. And the second row is if you can only do timing, but you can't change your foot placement. But if you combine these two strategies together, your basin of attraction is much, much bigger, especially in the lateral direction. So for all these plots, the vertical axis, the y-axis is how much I perturb the center of mass velocity, and the x-axis is when I apply that perturbation. So take-home message is timing is important, and it's actually not too bad in terms of nonlinear optimization, because the problem is still, the dimension is still very low, so I don't think it's so much of a big problem to run it online. The more sort of open-ended question I want to address is eventually is how to deal with these gaps between different hierarchies. So as I said, I have simple planners that's only thinking about, for example, the point mass dynamics, point mass level dynamics. But on the other hand, for the control level, it's actually reasoning about everything, all the kinematics, all the dynamic constraints. So in the current implementation, I pushed down a value function to represent the planner's goal in the future. But I also need a backward pass, a pass that goes from the controller back to the planner. This is important because, for example, imagine the robot runs into some kinematic constraints or dynamic constraints, and the planner is no longer good anymore. So the controller needs to tell the planner, you need to do something else. You have to give me a different plan. So if that information is not represented by the simple model, the planner is going to do exactly the same thing. So I need some way to either mark those regions out or apply some kind of a potential field to steer the planner away from those bad regions. So this is something I still need to think more about, but I think it's a very important it's a very important part. Another way of looking at this problem is if you can merge these two things together, which also translates into if you can run a very giant optimization online very fast, this naturally goes away. So this is essentially trying to find a balance between computation and amount of abstractions I make, a compromise between these two things. Sort of related to that part is how do I utilize offline computations online? So a very interesting idea is to, for example, generate a library of these canonical motions or these nominal walking patterns or nominal recovering patterns using the full dynamics offline. And when I execute this thing online, I just look at the value function, or I somehow come up with a quadratic approximation of this value function. That's what I meant by these oracles. So as long as I can recover or represent somehow this value function, the online minimization part is trivial in this case. Trajectory library might be a very good idea in terms of trying to offload a huge amount of computation offline and use them very fast in an online fashion. So the other thing, so that sort of covers the points about the higher level goals I want to achieve. In terms